It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in the neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Hello, neighbors. Great to be with you. My name is Matt Castleman. It is a beautiful day in the neighborhood. No, I'm not Fred Rogers. Hope I didn't trick you too badly. And it is great to be speaking live with my favorite people this weekend for the final week of Spark. You know, if you are new, to give a little bit of context, we don't always speak live every weekend, and that's because we're one church that meets in multiple locations, and we have a shared teaching, a shared vision, and a shared message. But on occasion, we do get to speak live at our sites, and when we do, it's about something important. I'm excited today to share something that has been burning on my heart for the West Side, and it's about neighboring, the art of neighboring, how to love our neighbors well. You know, I believe culture is becoming incredibly secluded. Front porches are getting smaller and smaller, and privacy fences are getting taller. As a nation, we're losing the art of neighboring. But you know who was really, really good at this thing? This guy. That's right, Fred Rogers. Who wore it best, side by side? Definitely Mr. Rogers, taking this thing off. Also, so I don't have a heat stroke while I'm talking to you guys today. It's a beautiful day. It's also a hot day in the neighborhood. Fred Rogers. We love Fred Rogers. Why are we obsessed with Mr. Rogers? Why is it that during that trailer we just watched, we all had momentary allergies, just sort of, oh man, something's in the air. It's because Fred knew how to love others incredibly well. He was an amazing neighbor, and he loved his neighbors well. Today, I'm excited to get to sort of process that with you. You know, many of us, I believe, are settling for a false version of neighboring, a false version of loving others. Mr. Rogers was incredibly helpful, not just for teaching us our left from our right or what colors are on a stoplight, but teaching us about love. Check out this quote that I heard in an interview with him. He says, "Love isn't a state of perfect caring. It is an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is right here and now." This applies to us. This applies to our neighbors. And it actually turns out that Mr. Rogers is basing this on a much greater commandment that we hear from this other person that we talk about around here from time to time. I don't know if you know him. What's his name? Jesus. Yes, Jesus. Listen to what Jesus says in Mark 12, verse 30 to 31. He says, "The most important commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as you love yourself. There is no greater commandment than these." Wow. I'm listening when I hear the words, the greatest commandment is, right up there with loving God, right next to it is, love our neighbor. How? Well, it's not just by being nice. It's not just by trying to not be a bad neighbor. It's by loving them as we love ourselves. That's what we're talking about today, how to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Mr. Rogers is saying it. Jesus is saying it. There might be something here for us. But unfortunately, many of us settle for a false version of it, don't we? We get fixated on, I just want to make sure I'm not offending my neighbor. I want to make sure I'm not being a bad neighbor. And we're missing the whole thing over here of, but how do I love my neighbors? Jesus is very clear. It's to love our neighbors. We try to tell ourselves things, at least I know I do from time to time. We try to convince ourselves that we're not that bad of neighbors. We say things like, yeah, I know my dog has been wandering into your yard every day. Free fertilization for you, though. I'm a pretty good neighbor. What about this one? Hey, I know Christmas was like 3 months ago, but these are festive winter lights, and that are shaped like icicles, and that fat guy in a red suit, pay no attention to him. We'll have him down by Labor Day. I'm not a bad neighbor. We tell ourselves these things, but really we're missing the mark of how to love our neighbors well. And the best way we can tell if we're loving them well is by looking at our actions. I want to tell you about the time that bacon changed our lives and our neighborhood. Yes, bacon. God bless America. Jesus, thank you for bacon. This is what we learned from living in Norwood. Now, in 2012, we moved into a house in Norwood, which I'm from the west side. My wife is from Louisville. Norwood is neither of those two, so it's its own thing. And so we had a house there because we were working at Crossroads, Oakley, so Hyde Park location, Norwood prices. Perfect. Worked great for our family. And we didn't know our neighbors well. Neither of us were from there. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Norwood is not like the west side. Right? No, people aren't just sitting out in their driveways, hanging out, inviting you over, playing some cornhole. Norwood is very different. It's you have to be intentional to get to know your neighbors, and so we wanted to do just that. So we're thinking, okay, how do we get to know them? And we realized, we have this rhythm every single week where we do family breakfast on Saturday mornings. We cook eggs, we cook bacon. Why don't we just invite them over? Invite some people over, see if they might be interested. And you know what? When you mention free bacon, people are interested. So what we did was we just invited a couple that lived right up the street from us. We said, come on over, and they came over, and what did we do? We just ate a meal together. Talked to them, talked about their jobs, talked about their marriage, and got to know them. And then they told their friends who lived up the street, and then their friends came over. And so we had a nice, bigger family breakfast every Saturday morning, and they told their friends, and their friends told their friends that their friends told their friends that their friends told their friends. And suddenly, every Saturday, we had 70 people in our house for this thing. We lived on Drex Avenue, so we called it Drexfist, and it grew into, it felt like a church, like all these people coming around of different backgrounds, different beliefs, all under one roof for a shared activity, and we suddenly started getting to know the people that lived around us. And what we learned through this wasn't that bacon is highly attractive to others. It's that we learned that God could use our small house, our messy lives, and our tight schedule to be a blessing to others. Here's just a few things that I was thinking about of how this experience shaped our lives. We realized our house wasn't too small. I don't know if you've ever felt that way before, that you can't invite people in, house is too small. Our house was tiny, and yet we were able to fit 70 people in. We were jamming them in all kinds of places, tucking them in drawers, shoving them on the back deck. We actually had what we called introvert corner, where all the introverts would sort of go and hang out and try to have their own little introvert party. We found one guy in the basement a few days later. He was fine. But God showed us that even with an unideal space, we were able to use it to bless others. And it worked. You know what happened? People weren't able to spread out and not talk to one another. It forced shared community, shared conversation around the dinner table. The second thing that God taught us is that our lives weren't too messy. I don't know about you, but our lives are messy. Our lives are a little chaotic, especially having 3 kids. At this point, I think we had 2 kids under 2. The lie that we believed was that we could not invite people in because our house wasn't perfect, that we had dirty dishes in the sink, that we had laundry sitting out in a basket and it wasn't put away. And what we found was that the people that came over, they actually gave us this feedback. It felt lived in. Your home feels lived in. Now, maybe that was just their nice way of saying your house is a mess. But we'll take it. Our house felt lived in. It didn't feel like a museum where you couldn't touch anything. I don't know if you've been over to people's houses like that, where it feels kind of cold and sterile, but our house felt like a home. Our lives weren't too messy. The beautiful thing about all this was when people would come over, they would actually take on shared roles to help clean up. We'd have people putting the trash outside. We'd have people sweeping and then mopping, cleaning off the counters. Our house was cleaner after Drexfest ended. I'm thinking, we should do this every day. This is pretty hot. Yeah, we got some laundry. I don't know if you want to grab the laundry real quick and fold that for us. That'd be great. But our house was cleaner because this was shared community, shared vision, shared roles. Also, we were never actually too busy for this. I know our schedules are crazy. I'm sure yours are too. We got little Sally in sports, and then we got Bobby, doing soccer on Tuesdays, and then we got swimming lessons in the morning, and then we got archery practice, and it's like the schedule is nuts, and it can be very easy to say, that sounds cool. We just don't have time for that kind of thing. Well, I would like to highlight the fact that we didn't have time either, but we found it. We find time for things like dentist appointments, doctor's visits, sports, right? Because those are priorities. Reaching out to our neighbors, loving our neighbors the way that we would want to be loved must become a priority. And so we just started scheduling it. Every Saturday, we knew every Saturday there might be one or two, we might be out of town, it might not work, someone else might have to come over and do it for us, but we just started calendaring it, and wouldn't you know it, God started clearing our schedule to make that thing stick. None of this is meant to be, hey, look at our awesome breakfast club that we threw together. It's meant to show you what loving others looks like. For us, loving us looks like free bacon and breakfast. And so that was our prompt to say, maybe we could share that same love with our neighbors. What is that? What is that for you, I wonder? Also, our kids were learning from us. We loved having our kids there because other kids in the neighborhood would come around. They'd see other people with different backgrounds, kids that looked differently than them. They saw that we were intentionally prioritizing loving our neighbors well. And the reason we knew that this was a success is because when we moved, we got called to the west side about 3 years ago. When we moved, it didn't die. It didn't go away just because we weren't there. People that were a part of it said, I like this vision. I want to do something for ourselves. And so it sort of morphed into a breakfast that met over in Pleasant Ridge. It morphed into a movie night that people would host once a week. It morphed into, I want to have a game night, something that proactively invited our neighbors into our lives. That experience actually shaped the way that we thought about this house that we live in now on the west side. After we moved out of Norwood, we moved in with my parents for a season, and great season, and we were trying to figure out where to live, and so we started praying about it. We started praying for God to show us the right neighborhood, for God to bring along the right neighbors, and wouldn't you know it, He did. We found an area that, because my wife has a VA loan and they offered military incentives, we were actually able to build a dream house for the same price as we were going to buy a house on the west side. So we got to build this house in this sweet environment that the neighborhood vibe was there that we had been praying for, and we got to design it. We intentionally built a bigger front porch so that we could be where the people are. We intentionally built a great room so that it would fit more people around the dinner table, around the breakfast table. We're right now, many of you have probably worked on it with us, we're building a back deck, a huge back deck so that we can just be where the people are. We've started praying for our neighbors. We saw amazing results when we did that in Norwood, and we didn't know who our neighbors were because many of the houses hadn't even been built yet. But we prayed for the right neighbor to move in at the right time in the right place, and God brought those neighbors along. We have an amazing, amazing neighborhood, and I know it's not by accident. I know that it's not by happenstance that God answered our prayers. Our neighbors are always outside. They're always inviting us over. We're inviting them over. Our neighbors like to help out with mowing our lawn. I remember coming home from South Africa and the grass was cut. So I turned to my wife like, way to go. And she's like, I didn't do it. Our neighbor just came over and mowed our front lawn. They get our mail for us. They help our neighbor right next door to us. It was the morning last year that we were all snowed in. I think it was Sunday morning. I needed to get to church, and I'm like, I got to wake up early, make sure I'm shoveling the driveway. And I walk outside, and there's 2 feet of snow that has been totally plowed out of my driveway, along my sidewalk. My neighbor, Tom, just took a snowblower and just went up and down. I'm thinking, that's amazing. Also, can I borrow that next week? I think we're going to have snow again. Our neighbors, we have every Thursday this thing called Thirsty Thursday. It's one of my favorite things. I don't know if you guys do something like this. You totally should. Every Thursday rolls around, and I find I'm incredibly parched. I'm incredibly parched. So we pull the lawn chairs out, the picnic tables. We have our kids running around. We get to know our neighbors. And then finally, I was reseeding, and we put a bunch of straw down in our backyard. And I was out there trying to pull it up because it had clumped all together. It's a pain. And my wife says, why don't you invite some of the neighbors over? I'm thinking, okay. I mean, I don't know who in their right mind would say yes to helping rake up straw because there's a lot of it. But wouldn't you know it, 4 of them ended up coming over. We had some drinks. They helped out raking, and we got to know our neighbors well. God has used this experience to shape our lives so that we can love our neighbors well as well. Some of you might be saying, yeah, well, that's great, Matt. You have awesome neighbors. You don't know my neighbors. I don't. You're right. I don't know your neighbors. So, what do you do when your neighbor is a jerk? Love them. What do you do when your neighbor doesn't love them back? You love them. Yeah, it's not a trick question. What do you do if your neighbor looks different than you, or has different religious beliefs, or voted differently, or has a different sexual orientation? You judge them harshly. Yes, no. Of course not. We laugh, but when we look at our actions, are we truly loving our neighbors? If you go back and you read in Mark 12, there isn't a loophole here that says, love your neighbor as you love yourself, but only if your neighbor is lovable. No, there's no special clause. There's no asterisk. It's love your neighbor as you love yourself. That means it is not your job to make your neighbor love you. You are not responsible for your neighbor to love you well. Your only responsibility is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Love them. Love them. Look at your actions. So, in our final few minutes together, I just want to give you a couple quick tips on how to be a good neighbor, how to love your neighbors well. Now, chances are many of these you actually learned from Mr. Rogers growing up, but when you look back through Scripture, you see Jesus teaching his disciples these exact same things. So here they are. A good neighbor, number 1, shares. A good neighbor shares. You've heard it your whole life. Sharing is caring. Yet, do we actually share? How have you shared with your neighbors recently? What resources do you have that would bless your neighbors well with? Is it a power tool? You know they're working on their deck, or they're working on something, and you say, oh, I have an impact wrench, you need that? What do you have in your possession that might bless others? Is it a lawnmower? Our neighbor the other day, I saw him hauling his lawnmower up the road because it needed repairing, and I just said, hey, if you want, we have a lawnmower that you're allowed to use. And he goes, oh, cool, I actually might take you up on that. So, and then once he did, I said no, but it's my lawnmower, it's my resource. Yeah, what resources do you have that would bless your neighbors well? Is it a stick of butter? This sounds silly, but every once in a while as we're leaving, if I think of it, I'll text our neighbors and say, hey, we're running to Kroger, do you need anything? 9 times out of 10, the answer is no, but sometimes. Every time my wife and I go to the store and we're buying meat or drinks for a big cookout, we always get extra. Not because we might be extra hungry later that night, but because we know if it's a nice night, guess who's going to be outside? Our neighbors. So we could always invite our neighbors over. And if they say no, then we just got some extra meat for the next time. How are you sharing your resources? How are you sharing your time? We all got it. How are you sharing your time? When's the last time you helped a neighbor to move something? When's the last time you helped a neighbor actually move in? Here's one. When's the last time you spent getting to know your neighbor's names? Ooh. Do you know your neighbor's names to your left and to your right? Bonus question. Do you know your neighbor's names across the street and behind you? Do you know their kids' names? This will blow people away if you just come over to spend time saying hello. People always assume there's an agenda, right? Always assume you got something. Oh, here comes the neighbor. Bar the doors, close the windows, no one's home. When's the last time you just stopped over to say, hey man, I was just thinking of you, how's it going? How can you share your time? And prayer. I talked earlier about praying for our neighbors, right? We're commanded to pray for our enemies. Sometimes our neighbor happens to be our enemy. So when's the last time we prayed for our neighbors? Include them in your prayer life. Ask them, hey, what's one thing I could be praying for you about? Now, here's something I've learned. I've learned that if I say, hey, would you like some prayer? Their head could be on fire, and they're going to say, no, I'm good. People don't want prayer. But if you ask, what's one thing I can be praying for you about? Usually they can think of something, and it lets them know you want more of a relationship than just saying hey across the fence. A good neighbor shares, and a good neighbor invites. When's the last time you invited your neighbor? Not just to church, but I'm talking about invite your neighbor into something you're doing. Invite your neighbor into your life, into your mess. I believe one of the biggest hindrances we have as a culture is that we want everyone to assume we have a Pinterest perfect house, right? That our house is just a beautiful Instagram filter. Nothing ever goes wrong there. We don't even lay down. We just stand in one place. It doesn't even collect dirt. It's a beautiful home. Welcome to my museum. We don't invite people in because we're afraid that they might not be used to a mess. When the reality is, that's their life. That's their life. It shows them, hey, we're the same. When's the last time you invited a neighbor into a birthday party or a small group or a Halloween party? These rhythmic occurrences that we have through the year that we know are going to come up are always great opportunities to invite our neighbors in. And finally, church, right? When's the last time we invited to church? Now this one, I'll be honest with you, I get rejected about 95% of the time, and they know. I'm the pastor too, so I mean, like, you know, to not come to church when you get an invite from the pastor means, okay, maybe they're just not ready yet. And so I've learned the whole point is not getting them to come to church. They may already have a great, vibrant church community that they're a part of, but the goal is to help them see the church. Maybe they see that in the way that you love your family. Maybe they see that in the way they love you, that you love them. Maybe you're the only person in their life who has a healthy relationship with God. Maybe it's not accidental that the people to your left and the people to your right are there because God knew you would be right here. When's the last time you invited someone into your life? And maybe they would say no to coming to church, right? I don't blame them. Church can be weird. But maybe they would say yes to helping out with the Thanksgiving food drive. Maybe they say yes to the Christmas gift drive or go local. And all these things, by the way, are things that all the neighbors that have said no to coming to church have said yes to because they get to be the church. A good neighbor shares, a good neighbor invites, and finally, a good neighbor asks. A good neighbor asks. Ask questions. Get to know your neighbors. Be inquisitive. There is nothing that drives me more crazy than somebody that doesn't reciprocate a conversation. Chances are you've been in this situation before where you're like, you hear, hey, how's it going? And they say, oh, I'm really good, man, thanks. Okay, bye. If you don't want to have a conversation, I would much rather you just tell me, hey, I don't feel like talking to you, and go back in your house rather than dragging on this dead horse of a conversation. Ask, be inquisitive, return the conversation, and be specific about it, right? Don't just ask, hey, how's it going? Because the answer is always good. Yep, it's always good, right? Ask specific questions. Do you know your neighbor's hobbies? Do you know their interests? One of the things I like to do is I ask questions like, hey, so what do you do for a living? Or I ask, hey, how's that job going? And they tell me, and then I remember it so that the next time I see them, I can circle back around and say, hey, I remember you were starting a new job. How's it going? You just blew their mind that you took the time and brain space to remember a detail in their life. Ask specific questions. What if Jesus meant that we were to love our actual neighbors, no matter what? Our culture says higher fences. Jesus calls us to deeper friendships. Our culture says, keep to yourselves. Jesus says, get in each other's lives. Pray for one another. Our culture says, our home is only a personal refuge. Jesus says, it is a resource meant to bless others. And finally, our culture says relationships should be shallow, but Jesus says to share our lives with one another. He's speaking to me, he's speaking to you, and he's speaking to your neighbor on your left and your right. So, how will you love your neighbor well today?